Hello, and welcome to the Let's Talk Transformation podcast. Today, we will be exploring the world of something that we all experience and we all struggle with, failure, but also the science of failing well. And I am delighted and honored to welcome Dr. Amy Edmondson, Novartis Professor of Leadership and Management at Harvard Business School and one of the most influential management thinkers in the world. Amy, welcome to the show.
I'm delighted and honored to be here.
Likewise, I am so excited to have this conversation with you about your latest book, The Right Kind of Wrong, and how it can teach us to thrive. Learning from failure can teach us to thrive. And, your research on teams and psychological safety is the reference for so many change and leadership practitioners. And I pull on it all the time in my work on creating more inclusive and collaborative human systems and helping teams to gel. And this podcast is all about that, understanding the experience, efforts, and mistakes that we can make in driving transformation and learning from them, of course. So can we start there then? Because humans aren't an exact science, are they? And neither is failing.
No. And in fact, one of the things I hope to do with this book is help people make a distinction between mistakes and failures that are not caused by mistake. I mean, I'm a fan of learning from all kinds of failures, but there are failures, and I think they are increasingly essential because of the speed of change and the challenge of the world in which we operate. There are many failures that are in fact not at all caused by mistake. They are the undesired, unsuccessful results of experiments in new territory, and I call those intelligent failures. So it's just I think it's helpful to get out of the habit of thinking that everything that goes wrong is a mistake.
Absolutely.
Certainly some things are mistakes, and a mistake only exists when there does exist prior knowledge about how to get the result you want, but we made a mistake and didn't use it or deviated from it in some way.
And I think the language is so important, isn't it? Because mistake is seen as negative, error is seen as negative, failure is seen as negative. And that narrative is perpetuated in organizations, isn't it? And particularly in whether we speak about failure or not. And we'll come to that. But before we go there, I would love it if you could just walk us through the three archetypes. You've already touched on intelligent failure.
Sure. Yes. So the intelligent failures are the good kind. They're the kind of failure that scientists do for a living. They are the result of thoughtful forays into new territory. So to be intelligent, a failure has to be in new territory, in pursuit of a goal, with a hypothesis, by which I mean you have good reason to believe it might work. And no bigger than they have to be to learn, right? So that's sort of the quintessential sort of scientific idea, right? That we don't really know, but we've done our homework, we develop a hypothesis and we try it. Now, of course, scientists do that every day in labs, but in our lives, we do that too. I mean, every time, you try something new or make a new friend or go on a blind date or what have you, that's the possibility of intelligent failure might happen. Basic failures are simple. They are failures caused by a simple, a single cause, usually a mistake. Usually a mistake that you put the milk in the cupboard rather than in the fridge and it goes sour, right? It's a failure. It's caused by a mistake. And then there are complex failures, which are multi-causal. They are the kinds of failures that happen when a handful of factors come together in just the wrong way. And importantly, any one of the factors on its own would not have caused a failure. You needed several.
And I think so. Intelligent failure is the right kind of wrong in terms of it takes you to new territory. And you have to fail to learn. It's a little bit like you talk about Edison and his 10,000 ways of but it didn't work until he got to the way that worked.
Exactly. And so if you're in new territory, if you're a scientist, if you're an inventor, if you're an innovator in a company, you know, intellectually anyway, that failures will happen. They have to be, they're the stepping stones to success because you're in new territory. But it's still not always easy to cope with it, right? You have to sort of train your brain to say, that's okay. Like when Edison said, I haven't failed, I found 10,000 ways that don't work. He's training himself to be okay with it because of the greater opportunity.
And I think it brings me to the whole idea of reframing and also context, because what you've just said about the three archetypes is around the context is key, isn't it?
Yes.
So let's go to context before I come back to reframing.
Okay.
Can you, and you give some brilliant examples in your book as to how context is so key, and the storytelling of, one of your first anecdotes around you as a PhD student and having a hypothesis and thinking that, from the airline crews that, teams made less failures and less failures if they were more collegiate, and then moving to the medical healthcare sector and trying out that hypothesis and finding out that, in fact, that wasn't necessarily the case. So can you extrapolate a little bit more on how context helped you there?
Sure. So first I'll say, I mean, when I think about context, right, that's a big word. What does that really mean? Or which dimensions of context should we be particularly tuned into? And I essentially identify two dimensions as important. One has to do with the degree of uncertainty that you face. Now, if you're a researcher, and I'll come back to my own study and also that aviation study, if you're a researcher, almost by definition, you're in a high uncertainty environment because you're trying to develop new knowledge that we don't yet have. And the other dimension is, what are the stakes, financially, reputationally, or from a human safety perspective? And you want, of course, to react differently or behave differently when you're in a very high stakes, high risk environment versus, a low risk one. So if you're in the laboratory, it's fine to try things that might not work, right? If you're at 30,000 feet with 200 passengers, you want to be very cautious indeed. And so context matters first and foremost. Now, despite that, arguably obvious intellectual point, people still struggle. Even scientists will struggle with failures in their, essentially low stakes but high uncertainty context, which is the very domain where you are dependent on intelligent failures to make progress. So in the aviation study, you had you had a hypothesis, which was that it was related to fatigue and functioning of pilots. And of course, it would be unethical to, tire pilots out and then put them in a plane to see how well they did, right? So you do it in a simulator instead. And so they had more fatigued pilots who were fatigued because they had just spent, 3 days flying straight through. And then you had the less fatigued pilots who had just come off of 3 days of rest. And to their surprise, they left them in the teams they were in. To their surprise, the more fatigued crews had fewer errors or, fewer problematic errors than the well-rested crews. And like, that doesn't, initially that didn't make much sense. But what they realized was that these individuals, they were coming together as teams, and as individuals, they were indeed making more mistakes in the simulator. But their team members were catching and correcting them, right? So that they had become good teams. And the good teams, as good teams are, were able to compensate for each other's shortcomings and perform very well as teams. Whereas the well-rested crews hadn't yet learned to team with each other. So as teams, they didn't perform as well. So it was a kind of surprise, finding, but a very elegant one in retrospect. Now, in my own research, many years later, very different context, I was looking to study, partly building on that research, whether better teams measured by a well-developed team survey instrument that measured teamwork, quality of relationships and quality of leadership and so on in teams, patient care teams, whether better teams would have fewer errors in the same way. Now, what happened was I got the data, I had the team data, and then I got the error data and I put them together. And my hypothesis at first appeared to be just totally wrong, in that the data were saying that better teams had higher, not lower error rates. Now, that was, wait just a minute, that can't be right. It just doesn't make sense. And it occurred to me, not right away, but after a few hours of just being very anxious and worried, what occurred to me was that maybe the better teams aren't making more mistakes. Maybe they're reporting more mistakes. Right? Maybe they're more okay with the reality of the complex error-prone system in which they worked, meant that the quicker we talk about them, the better we do. So that they were, when the researchers came by to say, tell us about, the errors that happened here this week, they were, here you go. Whereas in the other, in some of the teams that were measured as not very good teams, like nothing here, nothing to see here, So my hypothesis was wrong. I had profoundly failed in my research aspiration to show that something would happen that didn't. And I was coming to the conclusion that our error data were flawed, right? That they weren't actually objective, that they were in fact systematically biased based on something which I first referred to as the interpersonal climate, right? If you had a problematic interpersonal climate, you weren't talking about mistakes. If you had a good interpersonal climate, you were. Later on, I called that psychological safety.
Okay.
And so my research failure actually led to subsequent research successes.
Yeah, so basically new territory, discovering
new territory, exactly.
New territory.
So, but it doesn't mean that those first few hours weren't horrible, right?
Yeah,
I mean, I felt terrible about being wrong. I felt terrible about, in a sense, wasting the time of very busy doctors and nurses who filled out my survey, and here I was with, nothing that I could possibly publish or say. Until I began to think, wait a minute, maybe something else is going on here. And then, of course, that led to subsequent follow-up research to try to understand that better.
It's a reframe, though, isn't it? And
it's a reframe.
It's
a total reframe.
Yeah, but it starts with yourself, doesn't it? That's the biggest challenge, is getting over my own emotional reaction.
Exactly. So important. And the reframe in this case was one that sort of from, okay, well, if they've given me these error data, they must be right. And to wait a minute, maybe it's not the full story, right? Maybe this is much harder. Maybe collecting those kinds of data is harder than we had thought.
Yeah, and the assumptions we all have about what's right and what's wrong, and the confirmation bias we have to go and validate that. It also brings me to the fear of speaking up and the fear of admitting that maybe I was wrong, or maybe it's not going to work. And we hear a lot of competing narratives for me around failure, around the fail fast, which is very prevalent in organizations, or, just fail fast. I mean, in your opinion, Amy, can we fail fast? And what caveats would you put on that?
Right? If, right? So this goes back to context, where in a context where there's very high uncertainty and the stakes are manageable, then we can fail fast. And in fact, we should, because it's the only way to make progress. And so, if you're an entrepreneur, or you're in a laboratory as a scientist, or you're in an R&D department, you should be failing fast. I mean, you should be working fast to find out what works as fast as you can, and what doesn't work as fast as you can, because that's cost efficient, right? If it takes you months to find out that something doesn't work when it could have taken weeks or days, then that's just not a good use of your resources. So the fail fast mindset and mentality is a very good fit for reasonably low stakes and very high uncertainty environments. That's where it makes sense. Entrepreneurs, inventors. But that would be a very bad mindset for passenger air travel, right? Or for cardiac surgery. You want to succeed brilliantly, right? You want to be all over it. You want to be sure that people are speaking up in a timely way so that you don't make preventable errors and preventable failures.
Because if I look at sort of senior levels of organizations, a lot of the culture is still based around fear, and there isn't necessarily the speak up culture. And they talk about fail fast, and failure is mentioned, but for me that's the whole paradox. It's mentioned, but it's still taboo.
Yeah. Yep. It's kind of lip service.
Yes, absolutely.
It's yeah, oh yeah, let's fail fast. But meanwhile, if you don't meet your targets,
Exactly.
you're out of here, right? So there's a failure to provide context appropriate language and mindsets, and so then people just hear it as a mixed message. And when there's a mixed message, you're going to be cautious. You're not going to take smart risks.
And how can we use failure and what we understand about failure and context to counter that? Because if I look at what they're doing and how they talk about failure, and the fact that for me a leader's job is to create the conditions for people to thrive and for quality decision making to happen, but therefore we're asking them to create the conditions for their team to fail intelligently, but they're not. Often they're looking not to fail at all because it's their team, and therefore it's their reputation, and therefore it's this competing narrative again. How can they step out of that, Amy?
It is. And I think in the face of that competing narrative, many leaders just will naturally default to essentially the old-fashioned narrative, which is failure is not an option, you've got to hit your targets, etc., which is fine in an extremely high certainty environment. But most of the companies that I study or work with today are not in high certainty environments. And so when they're sending these either on purpose or just inadvertently, these strong messages that essentially say only hitting your targets or only perfection is welcome around here, it's not very effective in ensuring perfection, but it is effective in ensuring that people don't speak up. Right.
Yes,
so
yes, absolutely.
which is ironic because in a sense, what they're doing is making it harder for people to perform well, not easier. And that's not what they intend at all. So I think what today's leaders need to understand is that in turbulent times, that's what we face. Things are more likely to go wrong than ever before, right? And in turbulent times, innovation is more necessary than ever before. So for both of those reasons, the messaging needs to be, we are striving for excellence. We're ambitious, we're excited about our purpose and our value proposition, and we understand that it's chaotic out there, and we want to hear from you anytime you have a concern or an idea or, an opportunity that you see to sort of, innovate or, make things better. In other words, come clean about the nature of the turbulent reality that lies ahead, and be honest about the fact that some things will not work out as we had hoped. So that they've got to overcome the old-fashioned mental model, which is that the relationship between effort and success is clear. You try hard, you get success. You don't try hard, you get failure. It's like, well, sometimes that's true, but it's also the case sometimes, just ask any scientist, you try really hard and you get a failure because you're in new territory, right? And sometimes, believe it or not, one of us might mail it in and we get a success anyway through sheer luck, right? So helping people kind of update their mental models to be more appropriate for a turbulent, uncertain world is the leader's job.
And navigating uncertainty for them is difficult, isn't it? So if I look at perfection of I need to be right and not the right kind of wrong, it's the shift I discuss quite a lot from perfection to excellence. Now, you mentioned excellence.
Yes.
Could you reframe excellence for us in an uncertain world in terms of what it means for failures and how we could reframe our thinking? Because you're right, it's about the mental model and how we decide to think about it.
Right. And so first you have to recognize that you have a default mental model of excellence that looks like a perfection, right? And that's how we think about excellence. Well, here's how we need to rethink excellence. excellence means preventing as many, and there's no reason why we can't aspire to prevent all basic failures, and anticipating and preventing, or at least mitigating, complex failures. And again, I mean, there's no reason why we can't prevent most of them, if not all of them. And welcoming, embracing, pushing for more intelligent failures. That's what excellence looks like. And that means being error aware, being aware that errors will happen, so that we catch and correct them before they cause real harm, and encouraging smart risks, and closing down failing projects sooner rather than later. Right? That's what excellence looks like today.
Which is probably seen as a risk in itself in quite a lot of organizations, in terms of saying, I don't think that's going to work, we're going to leave it there and pivot, or not.
Right. Pivot. Pivot is a great word, and I bring that in the book because it's, for some companies, and I empathize, it's just too hard to say we're going to celebrate the failure. Forget it. We're never going to do that. But we can celebrate the pivot, right? And the pivot is essentially forward facing, whereas the failure is a little bit backward facing. Still important. I think we always want to look at our failures. We want to learn from them, but it might be an easier sell to celebrate the pivot. Like, what are we going to try next? What new opportunities are we going to experiment with?
Small is beautiful. Doing it to come back to some of your points around intelligent failures. But if I bring it up to a systems level, you talk in your book as well around systems producing consequential failures, not necessarily individuals. And the whole idea of, self-awareness, situational awareness, and systems awareness. And when I look at the way the world is interconnected, but digitally, but also just moving into systems, ecosystems within organizations, without organizations. Where's the leverage there in terms of the systems thinking? Why is it so key in understanding what you can learn from failure, Amy?
I think the leverage is primarily around humility, and then around the discipline to just step back and try to see the larger picture, just even if it's just briefly, right? We as human beings, we're prone to zooming in on parts, on elements, and when in fact the behavior of systems is almost entirely shaped by the relationship between elements.
Of course.
So, I might put in a new HR, sort of model, but if I'm not thinking about how does that affect with our sales processes, or how does that interact with our R&D and our innovation, then my beautiful shiny new policy might not work. So being systems aware is about the training to just keep thinking about how does this connect to other things, and how might what unintended consequences might this decision today have for later, so that I can get out ahead of it. And again, that's partly about preventing preventable failures.
And if I come back to the idea of systems, and we can't talk about learning today, I think, without talking about generative AI and what it's bringing to the table, and what does that mean for the way we learn, and particularly about failure, when it's all really about the human aspect of failure. So curiosity, humility, being able to reframe, being able to rejig our mental models. What do you see happening there, Amy? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I really have to say, I don't know. Right? It seems like a brave new world, to me, and to, of course, so many of us. That
everyone.
I know, my expertise, as you pointed out, lies in human psychology, group dynamics, sort of leadership models that help us navigate uncertainty. What I guess I can say here is that this is AI is certainly going to have enormous effects on the systems in which we operate, and we should approach it with great humility and great curiosity, and not assume. I think I hear a lot of, well, it's going to do this, and it's going to make this better, patient care better, but yes, and right, we better be very thoughtful and conduct our experiments, as one does in a smart failure strategy, at the right scale. We don't want to sort of roll things out organization wide that we haven't played with and experimented with to see to see how they work. How do we support people's decision making? But the final chapter of the book is called Thriving as a Fallible Human Being. Now, we are all fallible human beings, and that's okay. It's got to be okay. But how do we, maybe there's ways in which AI can help us be less fallible in some domains than we naturally are. But let's go in clear-eyed, because there may be ways in which it is going to introduce new failures that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, and what I took from your book as well is on that subject is we need to cultivate being fallible. We need to cultivate being curious about how fallible we can be, being comfortable with being fallible, and actually, using, that's the missing piece of the puzzle to what technology is bringing for me.
Yes, no, I agree. It's true, because if we can approach it with more humility, then we can let the technology be, serve us well. To do things we don't do well. It doesn't have trouble remembering things the way we do.
No, but sometimes that could serve a purpose, can't it? So, and if I look at success as a function of sort of fast learning from failures, just coming back to, you speak a lot about Toyota production system, the and-on chord, and being able to use the strength of early warning systems. What can that bring to creating a culture of learning, a healthy culture of learning?
There's such a lot to unpack here, and I'll start by saying many of the complex failures that I've studied, and these, if they're worthy of study, they tend to be big ones, not just the little ones. When you forgot your keys and you're late for a meeting and so on. But the big ones, like a shuttle failure at NASA, for example, nearly all of the complex failures that I've studied came with warnings, not obvious, like, here we are, we're gonna fail soon, but subtle warnings, what I sometimes refer to as ambiguous warnings or ambiguous threats, where and an ambiguous threat is where at least one sentient being, at least one human being in your organization or midst is worried, sees something that might or might not indicate the possibility that we're headed toward a failure. And what is usually the case is that those subtle warnings are squandered. They're not put to good use. They're not, it's not that you have to overreact to all of them. It's that you have to at least get curious about them, and curious enough to look a little more carefully at what might really be happening. And so the and-on chord in the Toyota production system is, in a way, it's a way to formalize the power and the value of ambiguous threats, because the and-on chord is a physical chord above the assembly line that is there and invites any team member to pull it anytime they see something, not something wrong, but something possibly wrong, and of course something wrong. But it turns out that 11 out of 12 pulls of the and-on chord, at least at one point in time when we were studying this, are not failures. They're not leading to, they're not, in fact, they were false alarms, as it were.
Not yet.
Not yet, right? So but Toyota believes it's worth it, right? It's worth pulling that cord. It doesn't stop the line to pull it. It starts a learning process. And because, first of all, the 1 in 12 is really worth catching and correcting. We don't want any failed vehicles, right? And second of all, it sends the message that we are a learning organization and everybody's continually learning, and everybody's eyes and ears, brains matter. But as a system, the Toyota production system, that's what they refer to it as. And it really is a system. It's not one thing. It's not just the and-on chord. It's the and-on chord plus the leadership role models, plus the just-in-time Kanban cards, plus, there's a dozen or more elements of that system that come together to build a whole that is more than the sum of the parts, a whole that is designed for learning and the production of high quality products.
Which brings us back to the whole systems awareness.
Right.
And
right.
Which of course you can't have unless you have the sort of individual self-awareness. And this shift from, I call it ego to eco, that is currently going on from individual to collective in all areas, particularly leadership, and particularly the sort of human systems in an organization, for me is really important. And we can learn so much from just observing how systems manage failure.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, and so many systems, I mean, we're all parts of systems, but not all of them are thoughtfully designed. No. Many of them are just haphazard.
Yeah, which brings me to the intentionality of designing systems of learning. So if I look at your research and work on psychological safety and failure, how do we intentionally design in an organization a healthy culture of learning, Amy?
Well, I think we, first of all, that we articulate that as a goal, right? That it's not a, it's not a, that in a way, the way to produce excellence today, products, services, is to be a learning organization, is to be part of a learning system, because there's just nothing static anymore. It's not as if, okay, we figured it out. Here's our, here's our formula for success. Now just go do it. I think any organization that is, is succeeding today is, at least to a certain degree, engaging what I'll call execution as learning. They're doing their work, but they're doing it with a mindful, learning-oriented way. They're tuned into the possibility of things, unexpected things happening or things going wrong, and then, able and willing to catch and correct. They're tuned into the ever-present question of, how can I do this better, right? Just sort of continuous improvement becomes essential for excellence today. And that's a, so it's a system in a way, it's a mindset of learning. It's a culture or climate of psychological safety that enables and empowers learning. And it's whatever measurements or structures or resources you need to do the learning that you need to do in your part of the organization to do your contribution.
Yeah, and it's got to be personal agency, hasn't it? Everybody has something to contribute to that. Everybody has their own mindset to grapple with, let me put it like that, because we do have to, it's not just a one shot, is it? You fail once, you have to manage your emotional reaction, manage the way you think about it. Second time might be different, third time might be different.
Right. And so, as you say, I mean, this is a lot of this is about emotional regulation. And when I talk about self-awareness, what I'm really talking about is being aware enough to know when you are and are not choosing learning over knowing.
Yes.
Because we spontaneously opt for knowing. I mean, we just believe we see reality in all its glory.
Yeah.
And we don't. Right? We see a reality through our own lens, our own background, expertise, biases. And so sort of actively overriding that way of thinking to say instead, I wonder what I'm missing. I wonder what Sue sees that I don't see. Right. And to think of the power of approaching relationships, whether that's with customers or team members, with that more learning oriented lens versus a knowing oriented lens. And it's immense.
And I found that part fascinating. And I think it's even harder when you're in a fast-paced delivery environment where, of course, you revert to type. Everybody does, your brain reverts to type. I know this, I know it will work, I'm going to do it. And of course, I'm looking for perfection, probably, and not excellence. But I think that whole mindset, I work a lot on diversity, inclusion, belonging, and equity, and psychological safety is a big part of that. It's not the only building block. But I love this discussion. And for me, your book has brought something new for me to that discussion, and another perspective of something else that is a building block for creating a culture of belonging. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that. I love how you put that, because in a way, this book, I mean, of course, my prior book was on psychological safety, the fearless organization, and how essential that is for being a learning organization and indeed for inclusion and belonging. But this one is more, that's all there lurking in the background and sometimes the foreground. But this is more about the substance of what it is we have to do. What the work looks like today, and the fact, and I do mean fact, that the work will bring disappointments. It will bring some missteps along the way to great accomplishments. And that now has to become a bigger part of the conversation than I think it used to be. Right? We have to talk honestly about even the basic failures and the complex failures. We need to talk honestly about them so that we learn as much as we can from all of them. And we need to invite and engage people in as many intelligent failures as possible, and make it safe to do so. And on the sort of diversity theme, one of the things that I talk about in this book is how in most organizations, in most societies, there is an unequal playing field for failure, right? Yes. If you're in the dominant group, your failures may be, or usually less punished than if you're a unique representative from a group that is underrepresented, especially at the higher levels of an organization. So your failure might be at risk of being attributed to other members of your group in ways that are quite scary. And so this is something we need to do better in organizations, to level that playing field, to let us all fail with impunity.
But I think it also brings it opens a different dialogue, and it brings a different example of how systems can work together in an unlevel environment. There are lots of unlevel playing fields, aren't there? But it just in the same way that psychological safety discussion allows the speak up dialogue to happen, and for us to understand what psychological safety means. It's not just about being nice. It's about healthy challenge. It's about having my ideas heard. It's about being seen, being valued, being heard. Doesn't mean my idea is going to be chosen. But, that whole framing of this is what it means for us. I think the failure and the fact that, you've simplified such a complex thing into frameworks that people then, their brains control a little better, so they feel a little bit more comfortable to say, okay, we need to talk about intelligent failure. Doesn't mean we'll never have basic failures or complex failures, but at least we have some way of making them tangible enough to have a discussion about how we can manage them.
That's right. That was the idea. And I thought, part of our allergy to failure comes from not having a useful and simple framework to sort the good kind from the bad. And I don't mean bad in a moral sense, but bad in a preventable sense, bad in a, when we are at our very best, when we are close to the ideal of a high reliability organization, for example, then it's not that people don't make mistakes, they do, but we catch and correct them fast enough to prevent any harm or downtime. And so it's an aspiration. It's like the holy grail would be, an organization that never has any basic or complex failures. But we've got to recognize that we're fallible human beings operating in fallible systems. So they will happen, and we are all better off when we speak up about them quickly.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I learned so much from the story in your book around Veuve Clicquot and everything that happened there and how that happened. It was completely new to me, and her perseverance and the way she looked at failure and the way she reframed everything. And I think we learned a lot about creative resilience, which for me is a skill that's quite new in organizations, resilience and creative, as opposed to rubber band resilience and just forcing through. And I think that this intelligent failure discussion can bring also a different dialogue on the framing of resilience. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, framing of resilience is such an important aspect of this conversation, and thank you for bringing up that wonderful story. And it opens the last chapter, and why I think this is a terrific story to illustrate sort of failing well and what it means, and how how any good entrepreneur is doing this effectively. Why is this a good story? Because she was born in 1777, right? We're so used to thinking of this as a sort of a modern invention, a Silicon Valley invention. It's not, right? This is old wisdom. Anyone who founded and then built up a new company, in at that point even a new industry, had to do this stuff. There was never anyone who magically had the entire sort of plan and just had to sort of put it in place, right? This was a journey, as all journeys, I think, all lives are, a journey into unknown terrain that necessarily involved many, sometimes devastating failures along the way. Possibly the most devastating failure was the premature death due to a flu-like condition of her young husband when they were in their mid-20s. And that certainly was a huge setback, but she resolved to keep going forward. Hence Veuve Clicquot, the widow Clicquot is the brand, and certainly one of the most enduring brands in history. So resilience, right? She demonstrates resilience, and it's a wonderful story. But all of us can nurture our capacity for resilience by better self-talk, right? By we talk ourselves off the the sort of catastrophizing ledge when we sort of say, okay, this was a setback, or this was disappointing, but no, it's not catastrophic, right? It's disappointing. What do I learn from it, and what might I try next, right? That's that's really the resilience phenomenon, is what will I try next, and how will it be smarter and better because of what I've just learned from this setback.
It's a little bit like the discussion around being a strong leader means not failing. Being a strong leader, you have to be resilient, and therefore we don't open the dialogue on it.
Right. And so being a strong leader means not only, that you will fail and you will be resilient and you will go forward. It means being open about that, because you need to help others. If you once you appreciate that that's the formula, it's your job to help others also embrace that formula.
Yeah, which is one of my last questions. Time is running, but how for you, Amy, can leaders explicitly use failure and the framework around intelligent failure to support building this healthy culture in their teams or in their organization, depending on where they sit in the organization?
Well, the most effective leaders that I have studied, either from afar or up close, are the ones who are, and recognize this explicitly, willing to own up to their own failures. Right? They're the ones who say, hey, I missed this, or this didn't go as planned. They understand that they are role models, and it is not acceptable or possible to expect other people to demonstrate those behaviors, but be unwilling to do it yourself. So I think the advice for leaders is kind of go back to basics. You're a fallible human being operating in a complex, uncertain world. Yes, there will be things that go wrong. Let's learn as much as we can from them as fast as we can. And let's make sure we have a healthy portion of smart risks, many of which will pan out as we hope, and many of which will not.
Brilliant. I'm going to leave our listeners with those final calls to action. I do have one last question, which is more personal, around you and what your most transformative experience has been in failure. If you had to pick one, what really sticks out for you, Amy?
Well, gosh, it's a tough one, because there's so many to choose from. But I will maybe just because we're talking about the book, for me, I studied engineering as an undergraduate, so I was not a writer. I did not write. And I had to learn. I mean, ultimately, I got to a point in my life where I had things I wanted to say, so I had to learn to write. And that is a process of coming to terms with your fallibility every single day, and realizing that in order to write something that's readable and compelling, you must throw out way more than half of what you write. You write it, you think, okay, I just said what I wanted to say, and then you look at it the next day and you realize it's terrible, and then you just make it better. So to produce a 300-page book, I probably wrote 3,000 pages at least, but ultimately, not all at once, right? You whittle it down. So for me, I had to learn the sort of painful art of realizing when your writing is failing and trying to bring it back to something more successful.
it's so hard to imagine when you read your book, which is
Thank you.
so well written. And I'm going to invite all our leaders to read it to understand all the anecdotes. We've not really touched the surface. We've looked at a few things, but it's a great book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Where's the best place for people to get in touch with you, Amy, if they want to know more about your book or if they want to engage with you?
Well, I guess amycedmondson.com, which is my homepage. I also have a page on the Harvard Business School faculty site, which is probably a little bit more consistently up to date with my latest articles and things.
Okay.
But I do my best on the other site as well.
All right, super. Well, thank you so much for coming and sharing your research, your insights, your stories. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation.